settle in and let your breathing slow, as if the whole room is exhaling with you. Outside your window, imagine another city, another night, London in the year 1854, where cobblestone streets hold on to the day's warmth and the lamps burn low and steady. You might think the danger is floating in the air, a sour, invisible fog people called bad air. But tonight, you take a calmer route. You watch where footsteps go, where water is drawn, where patterns quietly gather. In this story, you are not chasing panic. You are following dots on a simple map, with the Sleepless Scientist as your tired guide toward one ordinary pump and one surprisingly gentle idea. Evidence can be comforting. London is quiet in the way big cities pretend to be quiet. A low churn of wheels, soft voices, a distant door shutting. You move through streets that were not designed so much as they were allowed to happen. Narrow lanes, courtyards that keep secrets, brick walls that hold the day's soot like old memory. And beneath the calm, there is a familiar tension, the kind a city gets when it knows something is hunting it. Cholera does not announce itself politely. It arrives fast. People go from working, talking, walking, to suddenly folded inward, emptied by vomiting and watery diarrhea, drained of fluid until the body cannot keep up. In the 1850s, many Londoners do not know what cholera is in the way you and I use that word. They know what it does. They know the sound of a neighbor retching through thin walls. They know the hurried footsteps of someone sent for help. They know the smell that follows sickness in crowded rooms, where laundry is damp and air barely moves. So they reach for an explanation that feels natural. Miasma. Bad air. The idea that disease is a poison drifting through the streets, rising from filth and settling into lungs. And there is something emotionally convenient about blaming air. Air is everywhere, so no one has to feel singled out. Air is invisible, so you can imagine it, fear it, and never quite test it. But you are not here for the comforting story. You are here for the quieter one, the story where you look down, not up, where you stop listening to rumors and start listening to patterns. You walk as if you are reading the city like a page, not the loud parts, the shop signs and street cries, the subtle parts, where they turn back, which houses are suddenly too still, and very slowly you notice something strange. Fear does not spread evenly. Sickness does not paint the city with a broad brush. Some streets feel heavier, as if the air itself has thickened, but not everywhere, not even close. That unevenness is the first clue, not a dramatic clue, not a clue that kicks down your door, just a quiet imbalance, like noticing raindrops collect on one side of a window and wondering why. In Soho, in the neighborhood around Broad Street, the city is packed tight. Homes lean into each other. Many families share small spaces. Workplaces are close. People live near their labor because walking costs time, and time costs money, and money is a fragile thing. If you were committed to the bad air theory, this is where you would point with confidence. Crowding, smells, open drains, rotting waste. The whole area is a bouquet of problems. You could stand here, inhale the damp night, and tell yourself, yes, this must be the poisonous fog. But then you take a few steps and you find streets that smell just as bad, and yet fewer people are dying there. You take a few more steps and find buildings that are cramped and grim, and still they are not hit as hard. That is the part that ruins a simple story. And simple stories are very soothing right up until they start killing you. So you trade the romance of miasma for something more boring and more powerful. You start to count. It is not the kind of counting that makes headlines. It is the kind that makes sense. Names in a ledger, addresses, dates, the quiet, repetitive noticing that turns tragedy into information, one line at a time. This is where you meet Jon Snow, not as a statue or a hero, but as a working doctor in a tired city. He is the sort of person who does not win arguments by being loud. He wins by being stubborn and by insisting that reality should cooperate with the story, not the other way around. Snow has already been thinking about cholera for years. He has watched Outbreaks. He has listened to theories, and he has a suspicion that does not fit the fashionable idea. He suspects cholera is not floating in air. He suspects it is being swallowed. That suspicion sounds almost rude because it points a finger at something intimate, not the air that everyone shares, but the water you drink, the water you bring into your home, the water you give to your children, the water you trust because you must trust something. In the 1850s, water is not a background utility. It is labor. It is routine. It is the daily act of carrying, lifting, spilling, and trying again. So you follow that routine. You watch the buckets. You watch the pumps. You watch the lines of people, their hands wrapped around handles polished smooth by repetition. And you begin to understand what a pump is in this world. It is not just a convenience. It is a meeting point, a neighborhood organ, a small mechanical heart that pulls water from underground and sends it into bodies, one cup at a time. Now, a map enters the story. Not a magical map, not a treasure map, a simple street map with a problem drawn onto it. If you have never watched confusion turn into clarity, here is one of the most peaceful ways it happens. You take a sheet of paper, you draw the streets, and every time someone dies, you make a mark. A small line, a dot, a little stroke of ink. You do it again and again and again. At first, it looks like nothing. Just scratches on paper like the beginnings of a messy sketch. But the human brain is a pattern-hungry machine. Give it enough marks and it starts to see structure. Give it enough suffering and it starts to demand a reason. The dots begin to cluster. Not perfectly, not like a neat circle drawn by a compass. Real life does not do neat circles, but the density changes. The ink gets darker in certain blocks. It thickens around certain corners as if something is pulling it, and your attention naturally drifts toward the center of that pull. Broad Street. You do not need to be a genius to feel the significance of clustering. You just need to be willing to admit that coincidence gets tired eventually. If deaths are concentrated, then something nearby is feeding the outbreak. Something local. Something shared. Snow's map becomes famous later, but in the moment, it is simply useful. It turns private grief into a public shape. It gives an argument a backbone. Still, a map alone is not a cause. A map is a question drawn in ink. Why here? So you keep walking, You keep listening. You keep doing the most unglamorous thing in all of science. You check. You go door to door, not with a speech, but with calm questions. Where did you get your water? Which pump did you use? Did you drink it at home or at work? Did you boil it? Did you add anything? Did anyone avoid it? This is epidemiology before it has a smooth modern name. It is the study of how illness moves through a group. But tonight, it feels like tracking footprints after a snowfall. You are not chasing an animal. You are chasing a habit. And habits are easier to follow than people think, because most of us are faithful to routine. We return to the same handle, the same street corner, the same well, the same cup. In this neighborhood, the Broad Street pump is popular. The water tastes good, people say. Cleaner, fresher, less strange than other sources. And taste, in a world without microscopes, is a kind of evidence. Not good evidence, but understandable evidence. Here is the cruel part. Water can look clear and still be dangerous. It can taste fine and still carry death. You can hold it up to the lamplight, watch it shimmer, and see nothing wrong. Because what is wrong is too small for your eyes and too indifferent for your senses. Cholera is caused by a bacterium called Vibrio cholerae. That name arrives later, with the microscope and the rise of germ theory. But the organism does not care what you call it. It lives in contaminated water. It enters through the mouth. It survives the stomach's acid better than it has any right to. Then it reaches the small intestine and starts producing a toxin. The toxin is the real vandal. It disrupts the normal movement of salts and water through the intestinal wall. Your body, trying to stay balanced, suddenly begins pouring fluid into the gut. It is not poetic. It is not mysterious. It is plumbing. Wrong way plumbing at speed. And in severe cases, a person can lose so much water so quickly that blood pressure drops, organs do not get enough flow, and the body collapses into shock. In the middle of this, Londoners do what humans always do when faced with invisible danger. They try to make the world legible. They blame smells. They blame weather. They blame foreigners. They blame the poor. They blame moral weakness. Anything that turns random suffering into a story with a villain. Snow's approach is almost offensive in its simplicity. He wants the villain to be something you can point to without metaphors, so you keep collecting details, and the details begin to behave. You find households close to Broad Street with many deaths. You find households farther away with fewer. The pattern is not perfect because life is not clean. People travel. People visit friends. People work in other neighborhoods. People fetch water from a pump they prefer, even if it is not the closest. That preference becomes important because the map is not just geography. It is behavior laid on top of geography. Like tracing paper, it is the way human choices, repeated, carve channels for disease. And then you find the strange cases, the ones that don't fit, the ones that could embarrass your beautiful theory. If you are the kind of person who gets emotionally attached to being right. There is a workhouse nearby, crowded with people, and it does not have as many cholera deaths as you would expect. There is a brewery full of workers, and it is oddly spared. This is where a bad scientist panics. This is where a good one gets calmer, because exceptions are not enemies. Exceptions are instructions. The workhouse has its own water supply. The brewery workers drink mostly beer, and beer involves boiling. The method is accidental, but the effect is real. Heat kills many microbes. So the brewery, without intending to, has built itself a small moat of safety. The pattern holds if you respect the details. And now, the Broad Street pump stops being a symbol and becomes what it always was, a piece of hardware with consequences. You stand near it, you hear the soft clunk of the handle, you imagine the water rising in the pipe, cold and dark from the ground. You imagine it filling a bucket, splashing against the wood, reflecting lamplight like innocence, and you imagine, without drama, the other thing in the water, not visible, not smelly, not obvious, just present, just waiting. Snow's work is often summarized as if he simply looked at a map and declared the answer. But the truth is more tired than that. He argued, he gathered testimonies, he compared sources, he tracked a story through human memory, which is one of the least reliable instruments ever invented. And still, it was enough, because science does not require perfection. It requires that errors do not all lean in the same convenient direction. It requires enough coherence that the world stops looking random. So the proposal is made, not to cleanse the air, not to burn incense, not to flee the city, just disable the pump, remove the handle. It is so unromantic. It is the kind of action that looks like nothing. No fireworks, no grand medical procedure, just a neighborhood losing access to a favored water source. Congratulations, you have discovered the power of a boring intervention. The legend says that removing the handle stopped the outbreak. The reality is slightly messier. The outbreak was likely already peaking. People were already fleeing. The neighborhood was already changing its behavior out of fear. But even that messiness is part of the lesson. Public health is not a single lever that fixes everything. It is many small shifts that add up, some deliberate, some accidental. Still, the handle matters, because it is a physical acknowledgement that the source is not a curse in the air. It is something material, something that can be acted on. And as the panic quiets, even a little, you realize the most important discovery is not the pump. It is the method. You have watched a city become a data set in the gentlest possible way. A list of deaths becomes a map. A map becomes a hypothesis. A hypothesis becomes a question you can test by knocking on doors. And finally, the question becomes a practical change. This is the skeleton of epidemiology. Epidemiology sounds like a long word you would rather not meet in a dark alley, but it is, at its core, the study of how health events spread through groups. It is the art of noticing that risk is uneven. Risk is not fate. Risk is not moral judgment. Risk is a tilted floor. Stand in one place, and the odds slide away from you. Stand somewhere else, and they slide toward you. You can feel that idea in your own life. Some doorways are draftier. Some streets are darker. Some routines are safer. Most of the time you do not notice because nothing terrible happens, and your brain calls that proof. But in an outbreak, the invisible tilt becomes visible. It draws lines through neighborhoods. It reveals which shared resources are actually shared vulnerabilities. When epidemiologists investigate an outbreak, they often start with 3 quiet anchors: time, place, person. Time, meaning when cases begin, when they peak, and how fast they rise. Place, meaning where people live, work, and gather. Person, meaning what they share. Age, occupation, behaviors, exposures. These are not glamorous categories. They are filing cabinet categories. And that is exactly why they work. They reduce chaos into something you can hold. Snow, without modern tools, did a version of this. He looked at place with his map. He looked at person by asking about water habits. He looked at time by tracking the sequence of illness. And he did something else, something even more important. He compared. Comparison is the quiet engine of science. You look at people who were exposed and people who were not. You look at neighborhoods with one water supply and neighborhoods with another. You look at groups that share everything except one key feature, and you watch what changes. This sounds simple. It is simple, and it is unbelievably hard for humans to do consistently, because humans love stories more than they love controls. So you sit with the boring power of it. You imagine two homes side by side, equally cramped, equally smoky, equally alive with the sound of families. One draws water from Broad Street, the other uses a different source. One gets hit, the other is spared. The difference is not a cosmic curse. It is a pipe, a habit, a handle. And slowly, the idea of prevention begins to take shape. Prevention is the least appreciated form of medicine. If it works, nothing happens, and nobody throws a parade. There is no dramatic recovery. There is just absence, empty hospital beds, quiet streets, people annoyed that you made them change their routines for no reason. And yet prevention is where public health lives. It is where a city stops being a stage for tragedy and becomes a system that quietly refuses tragedy in the first place. Speaking of systems, your attention naturally drifts from one neighborhood pump to the body of the city itself and how it learns, slowly, to stop poisoning its own water. Because the Broad Street pump is not an isolated villain. It is a symptom. The real problem is the way the city handles waste. In mid-19th century London, sewage and drinking water are uncomfortably close companions. Human waste is dumped into cesspits. It leaks. It overflows. It runs into streets. It finds rivers. And the river which carries waste away is also a place where water is drawn. You can see the circular logic of disaster. Waste goes into water. Water goes into people. People become sick. More waste follows. The cycle tightens like a knot. So the city begins, slowly, to do something profoundly unexciting. It builds infrastructure. Not overnight, not neatly, not with unanimous political support. There are budgets, delays, arguments, and the kind of petty resistance that always appears when you try to spend money on something invisible. But the work happens. Sewers are designed, pipes are laid, pumping stations are built, filtration improves, water is moved from cleaner sources, waste is moved away from where people drink. This is not a heroic montage. It is men digging trenches. It is bricks and mortar. It is engineers arguing about gradients, because if the slope is wrong, the waste will not flow, and the city will choke on its own output. And here is the strange comfort. Sanitation is a kind of invisible medicine. You do not swallow it, you do not feel it. You notice it only when it fails. When you turn on a tap in your own life and water arrives, clear and ordinary, it feels like nothing. but it is the result of a long chain of choices, tests, treatments, and quiet vigilance. In Snow's time, that chain is just beginning to become thinkable. And while the city is learning to redesign itself, science is learning something else. Something even smaller. Because even with maps and pumps, people still argue about air. Many still prefer the old explanation, the one that matches the smell of the streets. The germ is too small to blame. The germ is too abstract. So the next stage of the story, the later stage, is not just engineering, it is a shift in imagination. A microscope shows you worlds that were always there. Once you look through it, you cannot unsee what it suggests, that there are living things too small for your eyes, living in water, on hands, on surfaces, in food. That the body is not just a vessel, but a habitat. That disease can be the result of invasion, not atmosphere. This is where germ theory arrives, gradually, through the work of many people, not as a single lightning bolt, but as a slow dawn. Observations stack up. Experiments repeat. Patterns keep appearing, even when skeptics look for a way out. For cholera, the specific culprit, Vibrio cholerae, is eventually identified. It is a curved bacterium, shaped a bit like a comma, with a tail that helps it move in water. It thrives in the right conditions, especially where sanitation is poor. And once you know that, dread becomes less mystical. You can treat water, you can separate waste, you can wash hands, you can prevent contamination. You can build systems that make it harder for the organism to reach mouths. Knowledge turns fear into chores. Not pleasant chores, but manageable ones. And there is something soothing about that if you let it be. Not because illness is gentle, but because understanding gives you handles. Real handles, not symbolic ones. Now, you might be tempted to think this story is only about one outbreak, one city, one tired doctor with a stubborn streak. But the method Snow used, the calm insistence on patterns, becomes a template, a way of thinking that travels. It shows up again in other outbreaks, in other places, with other suspects, food poisoning at a shared meal, a strange fever in a small town, a respiratory virus moving through workplaces, a contaminated product shipped across regions. The details change, but the quiet questions remain. Who got sick? When? Where? What did they share? What did they not share? And the tool that keeps returning, like a familiar lantern, is the same boring thing. A list, a map, a comparison, a pattern that refuses to be random. And as you keep walking through 19th century London in your mind, letting the lamplight stay soft, you can feel the story tightening into its next piece. Because if water is the pathway, then the next gentle question is unavoidable. Which water? From where? And why that spot? You start with the ground, because the ground is where London hides what it would rather not think about. Under the boots and cartwheels, beneath the spilled ale and horse manure, there is a shallow underworld of brick-lined pits and leaking channels. Some of them are called cesspools, some are just holes that have become traditions. They sit close to basements, close to wells, close to places where water is supposed to be clean. Mostly because nobody in charge wanted to pay to move the mess farther away. You can picture it like this. The city is trying to run two pipe systems through the same cramped body. One system is supposed to carry life in. The other is supposed to carry waste out. And in 1854, London, those two systems keep shaking hands in the dark. So when you ask, which water from where, you are also asking what the water passed by on its way to you. You stand at a pump and you see an iron handle, a spout, a small stone basin. You do not see the well shaft. You do not see the porous soil. You do not see the cracks in a nearby cesspit wall that let liquid seep outward, slow and patient, like a rumor. You do not see the way heavy rain changes everything, how water moves where it was not invited, carrying little passengers with it. And this is one of the crueler jokes of microbiology. You can do everything the human eye tells you to do and still lose. The water can be cold enough to feel honest. It can be clear enough to reflect lamplight. It can taste better than other pumps because it has fewer minerals, fewer obvious contaminants. You can even prefer it, recommend it, walk past other pumps just to get it. Congratulations, you have just selected the best tasting delivery vehicle for a bacterium. Now you watch Jon Snow do something that looks, from a distance, like being irritatingly thorough. The map gave him a cluster, but a cluster is just a hint. So he hunts for stories that confirm the shape and stories that try to break it. He listens for what modern people would call exposure. Not a dramatic exposure, not a glowing vial, just who drank what and when. In practice, that means your feet get tired. You go up narrow stairs into rooms where the air is warm and damp. You stand by beds where people lie slack with dehydration, skin pulled tight in places, loose in others. You listen to relatives talk over each other, trying to be helpful, trying to be heard, trying not to remember the exact moment someone stopped responding. And you ask the same simple questions again and again with the patience of a clock. Where do you get your water? Do you ever send someone else to fetch it? Did you drink it yesterday? Did you drink it at work? Do you know which pump you used? It does not feel like science. It feels like paperwork that happens to matter. Sometimes the answer is obvious. People point to the Broad Street pump like it is a familiar friend. Sometimes they shrug. Sometimes they guess. Sometimes they are wrong. Memory in an outbreak is a shaky instrument because fear edits your mind for you. Still, the pattern does not dissolve. It thickens. You find households where multiple people drink from Broad Street and multiple people get sick. You find homes just a few doors away where fewer people drink it and fewer people fall. You find outliers, the strange ones, and you treat them like treasure. Because if a case appears far from Broad Street, you want to know why it still belongs to Broad Street. And often, it does. Someone used to live nearby and still prefers the taste. Someone works in Soho and drinks there. Someone visits a friend, shares a cup, and carries the consequences back to a different neighborhood. It is not that the map is wrong. It is that human movement draws invisible threads across the streets. This is one of the quieter revelations of epidemiology. The city is not just a place. It is a set of habits that happen to have addresses. Broad Street is not simply a dot on paper. It is a daily loop. It is the place someone stops on the way home. It is the familiar handle under a palm. It is the small social moment of waiting in line, trading a few words, then returning to your room with the most important substance in your life, water, the thing you cannot postpone. And once you start thinking like this, you begin to notice how the outbreak respects certain boundaries and ignores others. It does not care about parish lines. It does not care about social class, except where class changes the way you get water. It does not care about your beliefs, except where beliefs change what you swallow. This is where the Broad Street pump becomes less symbolic and more mechanical in your mind. You imagine the well beneath it. You imagine the soil around it, laced with liquid that should never be near a mouth. You imagine a nearby source of contamination, something as plain as a baby's dirty diaper, water poured into a cesspit. You imagine seepage. Seepage is not dramatic. Seepage is a slow yes. So the question becomes, what could have contaminated that specific well? And the story, as it often does, points back to a single household. There was a baby sick with cholera, living near Broad Street. The soiled water from washing the infant's diapers was tipped into a cesspit. The cesspit, imperfect and old, leaked. The well, close enough to be doomed, received the contamination. You do not have to treat this like a perfect courtroom narrative. The records are old. The details are argued about. The exact plumbing is hard to reconstruct, but the idea is sound, and that is what matters for sleep and for science. Disease can be a neighborhood event, triggered by something as small as one family's tragedy, amplified by shared infrastructure. A tiny organism, given a root, behaves like a fire given dry wood. Now, while Snow is building his case, he is not doing it in a vacuum. The city has authorities. It has boards and committees and polite men who have never hauled water in their lives. If you want to change the neighborhood's behavior, you have to convince people who are more comfortable with theories that match their noses. So you sit in a room, listening to arguments that feel painfully familiar to anyone who has ever watched humans negotiate reality. Some men insist the smell is the cause because the smell is present. Some say the poor are the cause because blaming the poor is always fashionable. Some say it is God's will because that explanation costs nothing. Snow says, look at the map, look at the water sources, look at the spared brewery, look at the workhouse with its different supply. Look at the people who lived far away but still had Broad Street water delivered because they liked it. And the uncomfortable part is that he is asking them to accept an invisible mechanism, not miasma, but something carried, something you ingest. It is a deeply personal accusation. The city does not just smell bad, it is feeding itself its own waste. That is not a romantic idea. It is a plumbing idea. It is also correct. So eventually, in a small act of untheatrical surrender, they agree to remove the pump handle. You watch the handle come off, and the street does not change. The lamps still burn. People still cough. Horses still steam in the cool air. The city is still the city, but now the daily loop has been broken. It is not the only change happening, and it is not a perfect experiment. People are already scared. Many have left the area. Some have already switched water sources. The outbreak is already burning through those most exposed. Still, you see what matters. A public health intervention does not have to be grand. It has to be well placed. A pump handle is not a cure. It is a barrier. And barriers in the movement of disease can be more powerful than medicine. Because medicine arrives after you are already losing fluids, already trembling, already weak. A barrier prevents the first swallow, There is a second, subtler thing happening here too, and it is the part that lives on. Snow is showing the city a new kind of authority. Not authority by title, not authority by pattern. A map can argue with a gentleman in a waistcoat. A cluster of deaths does not care about your reputation. And this is how epidemiology starts to feel like its own discipline. Not just a concerned doctor, but a method for turning a city's suffering into information that can save the next city. You let the scene widen a little, the way your eyes adjust when you step back from a single street corner. Because Broad Street is one pump in one outbreak. But London has other water sources, other companies, other neighborhoods repeating the same mistake in different accents. Some parts of the city draw water from the River Thames in places where it is essentially soup. Waste goes into the river carries it along. A water company takes it out downstream and sells it back to the public with only the most optimistic form of filtering. Other companies move their intakes upriver where the water is less contaminated. Some filter more carefully, some do not. And this creates something epidemiologists love because it is tragically helpful, a natural comparison. In the 1840s and 1850s, there were cholera outbreaks where different groups of Londoners were effectively assigned different water qualities by geography and water company boundaries. Snow studied those too. He compared cholera rates in households served by different suppliers, even when the households were side by side. He looked for differences that could not be explained by smell because the smell was shared. This kind of comparison is slow and irritating, the kind of work that rarely looks heroic. You have to know who supplies which street. You have to match addresses. You have to trust records that were not made for your convenience. But the payoff is clean. If two groups live in the same air, and one group drinks cleaner water, and one group drinks dirtier water, and cholera follows the dirty water, then the air is no longer the star of the show. It is a quiet demolition of the old idea, not with insults, with numbers. And yes, sometimes you do need a number, even in a bedtime story, because numbers can be soothing when they replace dread with structure. Snow found that households receiving sewage-contaminated water had cholera death rates far higher than those receiving cleaner sources. The exact figures depend on which analysis you read and how the records were handled, but the direction is consistent and the signal is strong. Dirty water, more cholera. Cleaner water, less cholera. The smell may offend you, but it is not the delivery system. Now, while this is happening, the city is also learning its own lesson in the most unpleasant way possible. London's relationship with the Thames is intimate and abusive. The river is transportation, commerce, identity, and also a moving drain. Hot summers make it worse. Low water levels and heat concentrate the filth. The stench becomes legendary. And then, in the late 1850s, comes what people later call the Great Stink. You do not need to romanticize it. You can simply stand on a bridge in your mind and let the air be thick enough to taste. You can imagine curtains soaked in chloride of lime, an early attempt at chemical denial. You can imagine members of parliament trying to work while the river breathes into their chambers. It is disgusting, and it is useful, because it forces political attention. People may ignore invisible bacteria. They do not ignore a smell that humiliates them in front of their colleagues. So, the city finally commits, more seriously, to sewer construction and water reform. This is where you meet a different kind of hero, the engineer, the person who saves lives with gradients. Joseph Bazalgette becomes a central figure in London's sewer redesign. You do not have to memorize his name, but you can picture his work. Intercepting sewers, large brick tunnels built to catch the sewage that used to flow directly into the Thames through smaller drains. Pumping stations to lift waste where gravity cannot. Outfalls moved downstream, away from the water intakes. It is urban surgery, done with bricks and shovels. You can almost hear it at night. The scrape of tools, the thud of earth, the distant echo of work inside a tunnel that will one day be forgotten because it works. That is the strange complement of public health infrastructure. When it succeeds, it becomes invisible, and while sewers are being built, water treatment slowly becomes more than wishful thinking. Filtration improves. Sand filters, slow and steady, remove particles and reduce microbial load. Later, disinfection methods will arrive that feel almost magical. Chlorination, for example, where small amounts of chlorine compounds are added to kill pathogens in water. Chlorine is not a gentle substance. It is, in a way, weaponized chemistry. It disrupts microbial membranes and proteins. It makes water safer by being just toxic enough to microbes and not too toxic to you. Congratulations, your survival depends on carefully controlled poison. And it works. Cities that invest in clean water and sewage separation see dramatic reductions in waterborne disease. Cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, the old routine of mass diarrhea and mourning becomes less common. Not because humans became morally better, but because pipes became physically smarter. This is a theme you can keep close. The world improves when you stop asking individuals to be perfect and start making the system harder to fail. Now, back in the mid-19th century, germ theory is still not the dominant explanation. It is creeping in, but not yet ruling the room. And this is worth lingering on because it shows how science actually moves. It is not a straight line from ignorance to truth. It is a messy negotiation between evidence, technology, and human pride. People believed in miasma for reasons that were not entirely stupid. Bad smells often do correlate with poor sanitation. Poor sanitation does correlate with disease. So the smell was a real signal, just not the mechanism. This happens all the time. You find a thing that correlates with harm, and you assume it causes harm because it feels intuitive. Sometimes you are right. Sometimes you are one step off, and that one step can take decades to correct. To move from miasma to microbes, you need more than an argument. You need tools. Microscopes become better. Staining methods improve, making tiny organisms easier to see. Lab culture techniques develop, so bacteria can be grown and studied. And with each improvement, the invisible becomes less theoretical. You can imagine a scientist late at night leaning into an eyepiece, adjusting a mirror to catch lamplight, watching a droplet reveal movement that is not dust, not artifact, but life. Not the comforting kind of life, the kind that does not care about you. Cholera's organism, Vibrio cholerae, is a curved rod with a whip-like tail called a flagellum. It moves through water with an unsettling purpose. Under the microscope, it looks almost delicate, like a comma in the wrong sentence. And then you learn what it does inside you, and it stops looking delicate. When you swallow it, some of the bacteria survive the stomach and reach the small intestine. There, they attach and multiply. They release a toxin, cholera toxin, which hijacks the cells lining your gut. The toxin sets off a biochemical cascade. It increases a molecule inside cells called cyclic AMP. That molecule tells the cell to push chloride ions out into the intestine. Water follows the salt because water is obedient to chemistry. So, your body begins dumping fluid into your gut as if someone opened a fire hydrant inward. This is why cholera can be so fast. It is not merely inflammation. It is a molecular trick that turns your own transport systems against you. And the stool becomes what doctors described as rice water, pale, watery, flecked with mucus. The body loses water. It also loses electrolytes, the salts that let nerves and muscles work properly. The skin can become cool, the pulse weak, the eyes sunken, muscles cramp. The voice can become thin, because even the tissues of your throat are drying out. If untreated, severe dehydration can kill within hours to days. The good news, and yes, there is good news, is that cholera is also one of the clearest examples of how medicine can be brilliantly unromantic. The main treatment is rehydration. Water, salt, sugar, given in the right proportions. Oral rehydration solution works because the intestine has a transport mechanism that still functions even when the toxin is active. If you provide glucose and sodium together, the gut will absorb them and water will follow back into the body. So you can save lives with something that sounds like a sports drink recipe, except it is one of the most important medical breakthroughs in global health. It is a reminder that the body is not a mystical vessel. It is a set of levers. Sometimes you can pull the right lever with salt and sugar, but that knowledge too comes later. In Snow's London, rehydration is not yet the standard life-saving routine. Many treatments are misguided. Some doctors bleed patients, which is almost comically wrong for someone dying of fluid loss. Others give opiates to stop diarrhea, which may reduce symptoms but does not solve dehydration. Some try various astringents and tonics. Medicine, at that moment, is still half tradition and half experiment. And then, slowly, the evidence accumulates, not just for cholera, but for the broader idea that microorganisms cause many diseases. Louis Pasteur shows that microbes are involved in fermentation and spoilage, and argues against spontaneous generation. Joseph Lister applies antiseptic techniques to surgery, reducing infections by killing microbes on instruments and wounds. Robert Koch develops methods to isolate and identify specific bacteria as causes of disease. Koch, in the 1880s, identifies the cholera bacterium more definitively during outbreaks in Egypt and India. He sees it in patients, cultures it, and connects it with disease. You do not need to keep track of every name. Just the momentum. The invisible world becomes visible. And once it is visible, the old explanations start to feel embarrassed. Not immediately. Humans can cling to a wrong idea for an impressively long time, but eventually, the weight of repeated observation wins. This is where you can let your mind drift into the broader question, how do scientists actually prove what causes what without getting lost in coincidence? Because Snow did not have a microscope. He had pattern recognition and stubbornness. Koch had lab tools and culture methods. Modern epidemiologists have statistics and computers and genetic sequencing. But the core difficulty is always the same. Life is complicated. People are exposed to many things at once. They have different habits, different vulnerabilities, different living conditions. Outbreaks rise and fall for multiple reasons. Even if you find a correlation, it might be a coincidence, or it might be linked to a deeper factor you missed. So you need methods that do not depend on one perfect observation. You need ways to check yourself. This is where the calm logic of evidence comes in, and it is calmer than people think. Evidence, in practice, is repeated noticing with discipline. You see a pattern. You ask if it holds in another place. You ask if it holds after you adjust for other factors. You ask if it holds when someone else tries to replicate it. You ask if it makes predictions that come true. In Snow's case, the prediction was simple. If the pump is the source, those who avoid that pump should have lower risk. If the pump is disabled, cases should eventually drop, though not instantly. If other water sources are cleaner, those drinking them should be safer, even in the same air. In germ theory, the predictions become more direct. If a bacterium causes a disease, you should find it in sick people, not in healthy ones. You should be able to isolate it. You should be able to reproduce disease under certain conditions, though ethics limits what you do to humans. Thankfully, modern science formalizes some of these ideas. Koch's postulates, for example, were early criteria for linking a microbe to a disease. They are not perfect because biology is messy, but they represent a desire for structure. And epidemiology, as it matures, develops its own toolkit. You learn to compare groups carefully. Exposed versus unexposed. Sick versus not sick. You calculate measures like relative risk, which is just a way of saying how much more likely did illness occur in one group than another. You learn about confounding, which is the universe's favorite prank. A confounder is a hidden factor associated with both the exposure and the outcome, making it look like one causes the other. If people who drink from a certain pump are also poorer, and poverty is linked to many health risks, then you have to separate the effect of water from the effect of living conditions. Not because living conditions do not matter, but because you are trying to identify a specific route you can block. You learn about bias, which is what happens when your data collection tilts without you noticing. Maybe you only hear about severe cases. Maybe some deaths are misclassified. Maybe people lie about what they drank, not maliciously, but because memory is soft. So you design studies to reduce these problems. You standardize case definitions, meaning you decide what counts as a case using consistent criteria. You do active surveillance, going out to find cases rather than waiting for them to come to you. You use laboratory confirmation when possible, because symptoms alone can overlap across diseases. And you learn to love the boring details, because the boring details are where the truth hides. A case definition, for example, can sound painfully dull, but it matters. If you define cholera as any severe watery diarrhea, you might include other causes. If you define it too narrowly, you miss milder cases. Both errors change your picture of the outbreak. Snow, working without modern lab tests, used what he had: clinical descriptions, timing, clustering. He was doing epidemiology in a world where the instrument panel was mostly blank. Now imagine you are an epidemiologist arriving at a new outbreak long after Snow. Different century, different city, same human nervousness. You do not start with a speech. You start with a line list. A line list is exactly what it sounds like. A list where each line is a case, name or identifier, age, address, date of symptom onset, possible exposures, outcome, maybe occupation, maybe travel history, whatever seems relevant. It is not glamorous. It is a spreadsheet that smells faintly of despair. But from that list, you can build an epidemic curve, a simple plot of cases over time. It tells you whether the outbreak is growing, peaking, or declining. It hints at the incubation period, the time between exposure and symptoms, which helps you guess what kind of pathogen might be involved. For cholera, incubation is often short, from about a half day to a few days. That speed means when cases spike, something recent is driving it. You can also map cases by place. Snow's map was hand-drawn. Modern maps can be layered with water lines, sewer lines, restaurant locations, even mobility data from phones, if privacy and ethics are handled properly. The principle is the same. Place can be a clue. Place can also be a trap. People move, so you ask about behavior. What did they eat? What did they drink? Where did they work? Which gatherings did they attend? Who else was there? Who got sick after? And sometimes the answer is water again, in a different costume. A contaminated well after flooding. A broken pipe that lets sewage seep into a drinking line. A treatment plant that lost power. A refugee camp where sanitation is overwhelmed. A food product washed with unsafe water. Cholera still exists in the modern world, mostly where clean water and sanitation are not reliably available. It is a disease of infrastructure gaps, not a moral failing, a systems failure. And now you can feel the thread connecting back to 1854. The pump handle was a small barrier. Modern public health tries to build barriers at scale. Treatment plants, chlorination, sewage separation, monitoring systems, outbreak response teams, health education that is practical, not moralizing. All of it, when it works, becomes background. Which is why it is easy to forget how recently humans lived without it. You can let your mind linger on that. The idea that most of what protects you is not a hero, but a routine, a sample taken from a water main, a lab test run without fanfare, a technician logging a value and noticing it is off, a maintenance worker replacing a valve before it fails. The great victories of public health are mostly administrative. They are the kind of victories that would make for a terrible action movie, which is fortunate for your sleep. Now, you drift back to the logic of proving causes, because there is another quiet tool epidemiologists use that feels almost like detective work: contact tracing. For cholera, contact tracing is less central than for respiratory viruses, because cholera is mainly water and food transmitted. But the logic of tracing chains still matters, especially in outbreaks linked to shared meals or specific events. Contact tracing is simply following connections. You start with a person who is ill. You ask who they were near, where they went, what they shared. You identify others who may be at risk. You monitor them, test them, advise them, sometimes isolate them depending on the disease. It is not glamorous. It is a lot of phone calls. It is awkward conversations. It is the careful balancing of privacy with protection. And it works best when trust exists, which is inconvenient because outbreaks are also when trust tends to fracture. So good public health communication becomes another kind of infrastructure. Not pipes, but words. Clear, consistent information, practical guidance, respect for uncertainty when uncertainty is real, humility when earlier assumptions were wrong. Snow had to communicate in a world where his idea was unpopular. Modern epidemiologists often have to communicate in worlds where information is abundant and attention is scarce. Different problem, same human brain. Now, in your mind, you can move through a few later outbreak scenes, gentle, brief, like walking past lit windows on a quiet street. A small town where several families get severe stomach illness after a community picnic. You are there with a clipboard and a cooler for stool samples. You ask what they ate. Potato salad appears suspicious because it sat warm too long. You check who ate it and who did not. The pattern points to one dish. You do not accuse the cook of evil. You explain bacteria. You explain temperature. You explain time. You recommend refrigeration and safe handling. A cruise ship where norovirus spreads, a different culprit than cholera, but the same theme of shared surfaces and shared spaces. People blame the ocean air because humans love invisible villains. But you track symptom onset times and shared buffets. You find the index case, perhaps someone who boarded already incubating. You improve cleaning protocols and isolate ill passengers. Again, the victory looks like disinfectant and paperwork. A city with a spike in Legionnaire's disease, another water-related story, but with inhalation. Legionella bacteria thrive in warm water systems, like cooling towers. People do not get sick from drinking it typically, but from breathing aerosolized droplets. You map cases, find they cluster around a certain area, and inspect cooling towers. You clean them, treat them, and cases drop. The moral is not fear of water. The moral is respect for systems. Even influenza, a respiratory virus, can be approached with snow's spirit. You track cases over time. You look for clusters in schools or workplaces. You study risk factors, vaccination status, underlying conditions. You recommend interventions that range from vaccines to ventilation improvements. Ventilation? The air again. It is mildly ironic. Miasma was wrong about cholera, but air does matter for other diseases. The failure of miasma was not that it cared about air. It was that it declared air guilty without evidence and refused to update when evidence disagreed. Science does not reward certainty. It rewards correction. So you keep that gentle rule close. The point is not to replace one dogma with another. The point is to keep asking, what matches the pattern? Now, because this is a bedtime story for the existentially curious, you can also let the philosophy seep in without making it sharp. An outbreak is a mirror held up to a society. It reveals where people share resources. It reveals where inequality concentrates risk. It reveals what is maintained and what is neglected. Cholera does not choose victims based on virtue. It follows pathways. It rides the routes you build. If a neighborhood has no reliable clean water, that is not an individual's failure. That is a collective decision, usually made by people who will never drink from that pump. This is why public health can feel political, because it deals with shared environments, and shared environments are shaped by power. But you do not have to stay in that heavy place tonight. You can notice it and then let it pass. Like a dark cloud you acknowledge without stepping into the rain. Bring your attention back to the practical method, because method is comforting. Epidemiology turns fear into steps. Step 1. Verify the outbreak. Are there truly more cases than expected? Or just more attention? Step 2. Define and identify cases. Build your line list. Step 3. Describe the outbreak by time, place, and person. Step 4. Develop hypotheses about sources and transmission. Step 5. Evaluate hypotheses using studies, lab tests, environmental inspections. Step 6. Implement control measures, sometimes before you have perfect certainty, because waiting for perfection can cost lives. Step 7. Communicate findings clearly and calmly. Step 8. Prevent recurrence, which is the least celebrated step and the most important. Snow did many of these steps in a rough early form. Modern teams formalize them, but the soul is the same. And here's the strange lullaby in that even when the threat changes, the questions remain stable. Who, when, where, what shared, what different. Now let your mind drift back to the physicality of London's transformation, because it is one of the most soothing parts of this story. The idea that immense suffering can eventually produce quiet engineering. You walk along a street where workers are laying pipe. You smell damp earth. You hear bricks being set. You hear an argument about slope because gravity is the cheapest workforce and you want to use it correctly. You see a sewer tunnel tall enough for a man to walk through, built of millions of bricks. It is dark inside, but not chaotic. It has shape. It has intention. It is the opposite of the old cesspits, which were private and forgotten until they overflowed. And you notice a shift in worldview. Instead of blaming individuals for disease, the city begins to accept that the environment is part of the body. The water system is part of the immune system. The sewer is part of digestion. The street is part of skin. A city is an organism made of smaller organisms. And like any organism, it can be built to circulate nutrients and remove waste, or it can poison itself slowly. This is not poetry. It is literal. And once you accept it, you start seeing public health everywhere. In food inspection, in pasteurization of milk, where heating reduces pathogens, in vaccination campaigns that reduce transmission chains, in building codes that reduce mold and improve ventilation, in workplace regulations that reduce exposure to toxins. Most of it is invisible until it fails. Which is why, when you turn on a tap today and water arrives without effort, it is easy to think it was always like this. It was not. People once gathered around a single pump handle and hoped. Now, as you move forward from cholera and Victorian sewers, the next gentle question is not about disease itself, but about how we decide what is true when multiple explanations compete. Because even with Snow's map, even with later microscopes, humans remain vulnerable to the same mental habits. We confuse correlation with causation. We notice patterns that are not real. We ignore patterns that are inconvenient. We prefer stories with villains we already disliked. So scientists build guardrails. They use randomization in clinical trials, when ethical, to balance hidden factors. They use blinding to reduce expectation effects. They use peer review, imperfect but useful, to have other tired minds search for mistakes. They use replication, the quiet demand that an observation should not be a one-time performance. They use statistics not to create truth, but to measure uncertainty. Uncertainty is not a flaw in science. It is a label that keeps you honest. If you ever hear an epidemiologist speak carefully, it is not because they are evasive. It is because reality does not like being cornered by confident sentences. So tonight, you can let the careful language be part of the comfort. We know some things strongly. Cholera spreads through contaminated water and food, and clean water systems prevent it. We know that mapping and comparing exposures can identify sources. We know rehydration saves lives. Other things are more complex. Exactly why one person gets severely ill and another does not can involve immune status, stomach acidity, infectious dose, and genetics. Exactly how an outbreak will behave in a specific setting depends on behavior, infrastructure, and timing. And that is fine. Science is not a single, shining answer. It is a method for being less wrong over time. Now, as you sit with that, you can start letting the story drift toward other outbreaks where the same tools return. Wearing new clothes, not to frighten you, but to show you the steady usefulness of the method. Because the same kind of mat that solved Broad Street will later solve foodborne outbreaks by linking cases to a single restaurant or product. The same kind of careful comparison will reveal that a factory line contaminated a batch of peanut butter, or that a particular brand of lettuce carried bacteria from irrigated water. And the same kind of quiet, uncelebrated intervention will stop the spread, not with a dramatic cure, but with a recall, a closure, a cleaning protocol, a change in chlorination levels, a handle removed again and again in different forms. And if you follow that thread a little longer, you will find yourself in the modern world of outbreak investigation, where the map sometimes becomes genetic, because microbes carry their own history in their genomes, strings of nucleic acids that mutate slowly as they replicate. When you sequence pathogens from different patients, you can see how closely related they are, like matching handwriting. It is called genomic epidemiology. It is the same story as Snow's map, but the dots are letters in a code. You can trace a cluster not only by where people live, but by whether the bacteria in them share a recent common ancestor. You can identify whether cases are connected or coincidental. You can sometimes find a hidden source that geography alone would miss. It is beautiful in a cold way, like using the enemy's diary to predict its next move. But even this high-tech tool returns you to the same simple necessities: clean water, safe waste disposal, honest communication, early detection. You cannot sequence your way out of a broken pipe. So, the quiet heart of the story remains physical. A city that invests in invisible systems buys itself quieter nights. And speaking of quiet nights, you can keep walking through the layers of protection that now surround you without asking for your gratitude. Somewhere, a water treatment plant is humming, not loudly, just enough to move water through filters and tanks. Somewhere, chlorine is being dosed with careful measurement. Somewhere, turbidity is being monitored. That cloudiness measure that hints at particles and problems. Somewhere, a lab worker is plating samples to check for indicator bacteria, like E. coli, not because E. coli is always the enemy, but because its presence can signal contamination. Indicator organisms are another calm trick. You do not always test for every pathogen. You test for something that reliably shows whether fecal contamination has occurred. If the indicator is there, the door is open. And if the door is open, You close it. Again, boring. Effective. Now, you can let your mind rest for a moment on the difference between individual medicine and public health. Individual medicine is the doctor at the bedside. It is diagnosis and treatment. It is personal. Public health is upstream. It is trying to keep you from needing the bedside doctor in the first place. And upstream work always feels less emotionally satisfying because it deals in probabilities and absences. Snow's great contribution was to make upstream visible. A map made the invisible flow of disease visible. A pump handle made prevention tangible. And later, sewers and clean water systems made safety routine. You can feel the shape of the story preparing to widen again, away from cholera's particular horror and toward the broader set of gentle mysteries where the same investigative habits keep working. Because once you have seen one pattern reveal a hidden source, you start noticing you live in a world full of hidden sources, not just pathogens, but exposures of all kinds. Lead in old pipes, smoke in indoor air, tiny particles from traffic, chemicals in workplaces, mold in damp housing, noise pollution that stresses the body without you realizing it, heat waves that raise mortality quietly, especially in vulnerable populations. Epidemiology touches all of it because epidemiology is not about germs specifically. It is about distribution of health events and the reasons behind that distribution. It is about why some streets carry risk more heavily than others. And if you keep following that thread, you will end up in later outbreaks and investigations where the enemy is not always water. Sometimes it is food, sometimes it is air, sometimes it is a handshake that should have stayed a wave. But the tools remain gentle. A list, a map, a comparison, and a stubborn refusal to accept mystery when pattern is available. So you take that method and you carry it forward into a world that still gets surprised by the obvious. Because the next outbreak does not arrive wearing a Victorian coat, it arrives with a casserole dish, a factory label, a flight itinerary, or a polite handshake. And the first thing you learn is that modern outbreaks are rarely theatrical at the start. They begin as a few scattered people feeling unwell in private, an upset stomach blamed on dinner, a fever blamed on a drafty room, a cough blamed on bad sleep. Then someone counts, not out of romance, out of habit. A school nurse notices 3 kids absent with vomiting from the same classroom. An emergency department doctor sees a second patient from the same nursing home with the same watery diarrhea. A lab technician runs another stool sample and sees the same pattern again. And the machine does not care about your denial. And you, tonight, slip into the role of the person who gets the call, not the hero, the tired investigator with a notebook, a phone, and an allergy to coincidences. You arrive when the story is still small enough to hold and still dangerous enough to grow. You do not start by asking, "What is the monster?" You start by asking, "What is a case?" That sounds annoyingly philosophical, but it is practical. A case definition is a fence you build around the problem. Too wide, and you trap harmless things inside. Too narrow, and the real culprit walks right past you. So you write something boring and precise. A person with 3 or more loose stools in 24 hours, beginning after a certain date, living in a certain area, maybe with vomiting, maybe with fever, depending on what you see. If you have lab results, you add them. If you do not, you lean on symptoms and time. Because in the early hours of an outbreak, perfect information is a luxury you do not have. Then you build the list, the line list. Each person becomes a single row in your mind. Age, address, onset date, the first moment they felt wrong, where they ate, where they work, what they drank, who else in the household is sick. It is not glamorous. It is a census of misery, and it is the first step toward making the misery stop. Now you do the gentle triad again. Time, place, person. Time first. You sketch an epidemic curve, a simple bar chart of how many cases began each day. A sudden spike, then a decline. Often whispers, common source. Everyone exposed at once, like guests at a wedding eating the same salad. A slower climb, with waves, can whisper person to person. Spread. A chain that keeps lighting new links. Place next. You map addresses, not because you love maps, but because humans cluster. People shop at the same store. They drink from the same building fountain. They attend the same daycare. And a pathogen, indifferent and efficient, rides those routines like a commuter train. Person last, not person as in blame, person as in pattern. Are the cases mostly children, mostly older adults, mostly people who work in one building, mostly people who attended one event? Your goal is not to judge. Your goal is to narrow. And once you narrow enough, you can ask the question that sounds simple and is never simple. What did they share? Because that is the center of most outbreaks. Sharing? Shared air? Shared water? Shared food? Shared hands? Shared surfaces, polished smooth by 1,000 unthinking touches. Now, speaking of shared food, you can drift into one of the most common modern mysteries: foodborne outbreaks. These are the ones that look mundane until you remember that food is biology, and biology is never sterile. You picture a salad, bright and wet under kitchen lights. It looks innocent. Crisp greens, maybe a little shredded carrot, maybe a slice of cucumber. But leafy greens are complicated. They grow close to soil. They get sprayed with water. They get handled during harvest, processing, packaging. They travel through machines and conveyor belts that touch 1,000 other leaves. They sit in bins, cold and damp, which some bacteria find pleasantly survivable. So when you see a cluster of gastrointestinal illness and the interviews begin to sound similar, you feel the gravity shift. Multiple people mention they bought the same bagged salad. Multiple people mention the same brand. They are not connected socially. They do not know each other, but their grocery baskets crossed paths. This is where epidemiology becomes a slow, careful kind of detective work. You do not just ask, "Did you eat salad?" You ask, "Which store? Which day? Which brand? Which lot number? If anyone kept the package." You ask for receipts, if they have them. You ask the grocery store for shopper card data, if the laws and permissions allow. Because the pathogen, unlike a human criminal, leaves the same calling card every time. If you collect the details, then you compare. You find controls, people who did not get sick but live in the same area. You ask them what they ate too, because memory is a liar, and people love to say they ate something healthy. So you build the comparison anyway. If 80% of sick people ate the bagged salad and only 20% of controls did, the pattern starts to harden. That difference does not prove guilt by itself, but it points you toward the factory line, the irrigation water, the wash step that failed, the worker who came in ill. And here is where modern life gets both easier and more eerie. You can sequence the bacteria. If the pathogen is something like Salmonella or Listeria or a certain strain of E. coli, labs can read parts of its genetic code. They can see whether isolates from different patients are nearly identical. That near identity is like matching fingerprints. It does not tell you where the pathogen came from, but it tells you these cases belong to the same family, the same outbreak. Genomic sequencing is a map you cannot see with your eyes, a map of ancestry, a map of replication, a map of tiny copying errors accumulating as microbes multiply. And it lets you connect cases across cities, across states, across borders, cases that would have looked unrelated in the old days. So you can imagine the modern equivalent of Jon Snow's map. Not ink marks on a street plan, but sequences in a database lighting up as matches appear. A cluster forms, not around a pump, but around a product. And then comes the unromantic intervention, a recall, a notice, a factory shutdown, more cleaning, better temperature controls, a change in how wash water is chlorinated, a change in where irrigation water comes from, a small change in a process that most people never knew existed, protecting millions who will never hear the story. Now, you let that scene fade, and you drift to another kind of outbreak that feels almost quaint. A buffet. There is always a buffet in these stories. A long table under warm lights, trays and serving spoons, people leaning in close. You might assume the danger is the food itself. Sometimes it is, but often the danger is time. Bacteria love time. Give them warmth, moisture, and nutrients, and they do the one thing they were born to do: replicate. Some bacteria are especially good at this. Staphylococcus aureus, for example, can produce toxins in food when it sits out. Those toxins can survive reheating. So even if you warm the dish again, the poison remains. Small, stubborn proteins that do not care about your kitchen confidence. Or Bacillus cereus, which likes rice that is cooked and then left warm. It can produce toxins too. The symptoms can come on fast: vomiting, cramps, a rough night that feels like punishment for attending a party. And in these moments, the outbreak investigation is almost tender in its ordinariness. You interview people about what they ate. You watch the epidemic curve. If symptoms start within a few hours after the meal, you think toxin. If it takes a day or two, you think infection. Something that needed time to grow in the body. This timing, the incubation period, is a quiet fingerprint, a clue you can feel in the clock. And again, your intervention is not heroism. It is telling people, keep hot foods hot, keep cold foods cold. Do not let a tray linger in the lukewarm middle where bacteria thrive. It is kitchen physics. It is temperature as a public health tool. Now, speaking of temperature, you can pivot gently to another kind of outbreak that still feels oddly modern. The one where the environment itself becomes the shared exposure. Legionnaire's disease is a good example. It is caused by Legionella bacteria. They like warm water, especially in complex building systems, cooling towers, hot tubs, large plumbing systems that have dead ends where water sits. You do not usually catch it by drinking. You catch it by breathing tiny droplets aerosolized water that carries the bacteria into your lungs. So the story looks strange at first. People with pneumonia scattered across a city, not family members, not coworkers, not obvious contacts, but when you map where they were during the incubation window, a cluster forms around a particular neighborhood, around a hotel, around a hospital, around an office building with a cooling tower on the roof, quietly misting the air, and the investigation becomes half interviews, half engineering. Inspect the water system, measure disinfectant levels, look for stagnation, look for warm temperatures in the wrong places, collect water samples, culture the bacteria, sequence it, match it to patient isolates, then the fix, clean the tower, shock chlorinate, raise temperatures where needed, remove dead legs in plumbing, maintain the system properly. Again, the victory is maintenance. Now, you can let the method wander into the kind of outbreak that pulls the most attention because it spreads through something you cannot choose to stop doing: breathing. Respiratory outbreaks are the ones that make humans suddenly aware of the invisible, which is amusing in a bleak way because the invisible was always running the place. For a respiratory virus, the chain is often person to person, a cough in a closed room, a conversation in close distance, a shared indoor space with stale air that has been breathed too many times. And you become, again, the investigator with the list. But here, the list becomes a web. You ask about contacts. Who did you spend time with? Where did you go? Work, school, gatherings, transit. You build a network and you try to find the nodes that matter, not to shame them, but because the network is how the pathogen travels. Sometimes you find a super spreading event. That term sounds dramatic, but it usually means something boring: an indoor gathering, poor ventilation, many people for many hours, loud talking or singing. A pathogen that does not need permission. You can almost hear the logic click into place. Not everyone spreads equally, not because they are villains, but because their situation aligns with transmission. Epidemiology, at its best, does not moralize. It describes the geometry of risk. Now, while the public imagines outbreak investigation as chasing a single patient zero, you learn quickly that patient zero is often a myth humans invent to make randomness feel personal. Real outbreaks are messy. They have multiple introductions. They have asymptomatic infections, people who feel fine but still shed virus. They have delays in detection because not everyone seeks care and not everyone is tested. So instead of obsessing over the first person, you focus on the early pattern. Where are cases rising? Which age groups? Which settings? What does the epidemic curve look like? And you use comparisons again. If a workplace has an outbreak, you compare infected and uninfected workers. Do cases cluster on one shift, one room, one break area, one ventilation zone? Does opening windows help? Do air filters reduce spread? Does masking reduce spread? You are not debating ideology. You are checking the pattern. And as you check, you learn something that becomes another quiet lullaby. Risk is not a single thing. Risk is layered. It is exposure, how much pathogen you encounter. It is susceptibility, how likely your body is to be harmed. It is environment, how easily the pathogen moves. It is time, how long you spend in the wrong place. Epidemiology is the craft of stacking those layers until the picture becomes clear enough to act. Now, while you are still in this modern landscape, you can drift into a tool that sounds cold but is deeply human. Surveillance, not the ominous kind. Public health surveillance is simply the habit of watching consistently so you can notice change. Hospitals report certain infections. Labs report positive tests. Clinics report syndromes like influenza-like illness even before specific diagnoses are confirmed. Wastewater is monitored too. Yes, sewage again, still doing its quiet work. In many cities, wastewater surveillance can detect viral genetic material shed in feces. It can give an early signal that infections are rising, even before people show up at clinics. It is the city, sampled and read like a collective diary, a modern echo of Victorian sewers, turned into an instrument. And it fits the theme perfectly. The healthiest systems are the ones you forget until they notice something for you. Now, it is easy to treat all this as a triumphal march of science, one tool replacing another. But real public health is full of limitations, and those limitations matter. Data is never complete. People do not always test. Some communities have less access to care, so their cases are less visible. Reporting can lag. Tests can have false negatives and false positives. Even defining a case can be difficult when symptoms overlap across diseases. So you learn to live with uncertainty the way sailors live with fog. You navigate anyway, using what you have. You look for signals that persist across different data sources: hospitalizations, lab confirmations, syndromic surveillance, school absences, wastewater trends. None is perfect alone. Together, they form a shape you can trust more than any one point. And you learn another unglamorous truth. Outbreak response is often a race against time, not a search for perfection. If you wait until you are 100% sure, you will be sure, and too late. So you act when the evidence is sufficient. You issue advisories. You close a restaurant. You recall a product. You recommend boiling water. Boil water advisories are an ancient intervention wearing modern language because heat is still one of the simplest microbial killers you have. And it is almost poetic in a tired way. After all our sequencing and statistics, sometimes the answer is still bring water to a rolling boil. Now, you can let your mind drift back to cholera's particular corner of this modern world, because cholera never really left. It just became geographically shy. In places with reliable water treatment and sanitation, cholera outbreaks are rare. In places without those systems, cholera can still move fast. It thrives after disasters, floods that overwhelm sewage systems, earthquakes that break pipes, conflict that displaces people into crowded camps. It thrives where water is scarce enough that people have to choose between thirst and risk. And in those settings, epidemiology looks like logistics. Setting up clean water distribution, building latrines at safe distances from water sources, chlorinating water at collection points, educating communities in practical steps like safe storage and hand hygiene, setting up oral rehydration stations because dehydration is the immediate killer. Sometimes vaccination is used too. Oral cholera vaccines exist, and they can reduce risk in outbreaks, especially as a bridge, while sanitation improves. But vaccines do not replace clean water. They buy time. They lower the peak. They reduce deaths. They do not rebuild pipes. So you see the same lesson again. The pathogen is biological, but the solution is often structural. Now, as you move through these scenes, you start to notice how often the work depends on something that sounds gentle and is actually difficult: asking people questions. The interview is one of the primary instruments of epidemiology, and it is flawed. People forget. People misremember. People answer what they think you want to hear. People do not want to admit they ate undercooked meat, or drank unfiltered water, or went to a gathering they were told to avoid, not because they are evil, because humans protect their self-image like it is a vital organ. So, epidemiologists learn to ask questions in ways that reduce shame and improve accuracy. They ask about timelines, not just yes or no. They ask people to walk through their day. They ask about grocery shopping habits. They use receipts, if available. They use objective data when they can, but they do not assume it exists. They learn to be both patient and skeptical. And here is the part that is quietly comforting. Even with all the flaws, patterns still emerge. Because outbreaks, like gravity, have a kind of stubborn consistency. The signal can be noisy, but if the exposure is real, it tends to show itself again and again. Now, you can drift into a classic outbreak investigation story that feels almost like a parable, without needing it to be dramatic. A small town gets reports of severe diarrhea and kidney problems in children. The lab finds a strain of E. coli that produces a toxin, Shiga toxin. This is not the harmless E. coli that lives peacefully in your gut. This is a relative that came to ruin the family reunion. The cases cluster in time. They cluster in age. Investigators interview families. They look for common foods. Ground beef is a usual suspect because grinding can mix bacteria throughout the meat. Leafy greens can be suspects too. Unpasteurized milk sometimes. Petting zoos occasionally, because animals can carry certain E. coli strains without being sick. The investigators build a case control study. They find that many sick children visited the same fair, petted the same animals, ate snacks, then touched their mouths. The fix is not to ban animals from existence. It is to improve hand-washing stations, to separate eating areas from animal contact, to educate families, to clean surfaces, to design the environment so the easy choice is the safe choice. Again, a system fix. And if you listen closely, you can hear the echo of Broad Street. Not a pump handle this time, a hand-washing station. A barrier between waist and mouth. The route matters more than the moral. Now, as you keep moving, you notice that some of the most effective interventions are the ones people resist because they feel boring and inconvenient. Vaccination is one. It is a preventive act, and prevention is hard to sell to brains that crave immediate reward. Vaccines work by training the immune system, giving it a rehearsal so the real performance is faster. They do not always prevent infection entirely, depending on the pathogen, but they can reduce severity, reduce transmission, reduce the burden on hospitals. And from an epidemiology perspective, vaccines create a change you can measure. You compare disease rates before and after vaccination campaigns. You compare vaccinated and unvaccinated groups while accounting for differences. You look for herd effects, where even unvaccinated people benefit because transmission chains break. It is all pattern work, again. But vaccines also reveal the sociology of outbreaks, because a vaccine is a biological tool delivered through human trust. No trust, no uptake. Low uptake, ongoing transmission. So public health becomes partly immunology, partly communication, partly ethics, partly logistics. A disease does not care about your politics. but your politics can determine how well you respond. Now, without getting stuck in heaviness, you can let that thought float past and return to the quieter comfort of infrastructure. Because if there is a single unglamorous hero in this whole anthology, it is the routine testing that happens when nobody is watching. Water testing, food safety inspections, restaurant temperature logs, hospital infection control protocols, air handling standards in certain buildings. All of it is a quiet refusal to be surprised. And the public mostly ignores it, which is understandable. You do not want to spend your day thinking about sewage and bacteria. You want the illusion that the world is clean by default. But clean is not default. Clean is maintained. Now, you can zoom into one of those maintenance rituals because it is weirdly calming to understand it. Consider drinking water treatment. Raw water comes from a river, a lake, a reservoir. It carries suspended particles, tiny bits of soil, organic material, microbes. The first step is often coagulation and flocculation. Chemicals are added that cause small particles to clump together into larger flocks. These flocks settle out in sedimentation basins. Then the water is filtered, often through sand or other media, removing remaining particles. Then it is disinfected, commonly with chlorine compounds. Some systems use ozone or ultraviolet light, depending on design. Chlorine leaves a residual, a small lasting presence that continues to protect water as it travels through pipes. That residual matters because pipes are not perfect. They can leak, they can lose pressure, they can allow contamination to enter if something goes wrong. So the chlorine is like a quiet guard, riding along with the water. And yes, it changes taste a little. You can taste safety, faintly, in some cities. And then the system is monitored. Turbidity, the cloudiness, because high turbidity can protect microbes from disinfection. Chlorine residual, because too low is unsafe and too high is unpleasant or harmful. Indicator organisms, because they signal contamination. This constant measurement is the modern version of snow's stubbornness. Do not assume. Check. Now, because this is an epidemiology story at heart, you can appreciate how measurement connects to action. If a treatment plant detects a problem, it can issue a boil water advisory. If a city detects contamination, it can flush lines, repair breaks, adjust disinfection. If a lab detects a pathogen in a food sample, it can trigger inspections and recalls. And the average person sleeps through it all, unaware, which is, honestly, the goal. Now, speaking of sleeping through things, you can follow the thread into hospitals, where another kind of outbreak quietly tries to happen. Healthcare-associated infections. These are infections people acquire while receiving care. They include things like Clostridioides difficile, often called C. diff, a bacterium that can cause severe diarrhea after antibiotic use, disrupts the gut microbiome. They include methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, called MRSA, a resistant strain that can cause skin and deeper infections. They include bloodstream infections from catheters, pneumonia from ventilators, surgical site infections. This is where epidemiology becomes very local. A cluster in one ward, a rise in one type of infection. Infection control teams track rates, audit hand hygiene, review cleaning protocols, check antibiotic prescribing, culture surfaces if needed. They might notice that one piece of equipment is being cleaned improperly, or that staffing shortages led to rushed care, or that a particular disinfectant is not effective against spores like C. diff spores, which are stubborn little survival capsules. So, the fix is, again, unromantic, better cleaning, different disinfectant, more hand washing with soap and water, not just alcohol gel, because spores resist alcohol. Better antibiotic stewardship, meaning using antibiotics only when needed and choosing appropriately so you do not wipe out helpful bacteria and invite opportunists. And what you see, if you look long enough, is that the same logic keeps scaling, from a pump handle to a hospital protocol, from a street map to a genome database, from a cesspit leak to a cooling tower. The details change, the method persists. Now, your mind can wander to one more modern tool, one that sounds dull but has a quiet power. Mathematical modeling. Models are not crystal balls. They are simplified stories written in equations. They take assumptions about transmission, contact patterns, incubation periods, and they simulate how an outbreak might behave. The simplest models divide people into compartments: susceptible, infected, recovered. You move through them like rooms in a building. The rates of movement depend on how contagious the pathogen is, how often people contact each other, how long infectiousness lasts. From that, you get a sense of growth. If each infected person infects more than one other person, on average, the outbreak grows. If less than one, it shrinks. That average is often called the reproduction number, and it changes with behavior. It is not a fixed property of the pathogen alone. It depends on the world you give the pathogen: ventilation, crowding, hygiene, vaccination, masks, isolation. All of these change the effective reproduction number, and this can be soothing in a bleak way, because it means outbreaks are not pure fate. They are physics plus choices. Now, models can be wrong. They can be wrong because assumptions were wrong. They can be wrong because behavior changed. They can be wrong because the data feeding them was incomplete. But even imperfect models can help with planning. How many hospital beds might be needed? How much vaccine supply? What timing of interventions matters? And again, it is the same humble theme. Do not worship the model. Use it, check it, update it. A model is a map, not the territory. Jon Snow, if he were forced into a modern office with fluorescent lights, would probably approve of that attitude, then complain about the coffee. Now, after all these modern mysteries, your mind can drift back toward the quieter comfort that underlies them. Most nights, you are not in an outbreak. Most nights, the systems work. Your water is treated. Your waste goes away. Your food is inspected more than you realize. The air in most places is not perfect, but it is managed in ways people did not have in 1854. And because it works, it disappears from your awareness. Which is why it is easy to think safety is natural. It is not. Safety is built. Safety is tested. Safety is repaired at 3 in the morning by someone whose name you will never know. And the strange gift of stories like Broad Street is that they let you feel gratitude without needing drama. A map, a handle, a sewer, a filter bed, a chlorine residual, a lab-cultured plate with small colonies growing like quiet punctuation marks. All of it is a language the city uses to keep you alive. Now, there is one more gentle layer to notice, and it is about how we decide what to believe when the evidence is not clean. Because in the real world, you often get partial clues, conflicting reports, political noise, media stories that magnify the dramatic parts and ignore the boring ones. So epidemiology leans on a set of habits that are worth keeping close, even outside disease. One habit is triangulation. Do multiple lines of evidence point the same way? Do interviews, lab data, and environmental sampling agree? Does the timing match the suspected exposure? Does the geographic clustering make sense for the route of transmission? If different methods with different biases all suggest the same source, your confidence grows. Another habit is humility about causality. You can have strong evidence and still be careful. You can say, this is the most likely source based on what we know now. You can act on that while still gathering more information, because acting and learning can happen together. And this is a quiet mercy of good science. It does not demand certainty before compassion. It demands enough clarity to reduce harm. Now, speaking of reducing harm, you can sink into the smallest, most personal scale of prevention. Hand hygiene. It sounds childish. It is not. Your hands are the main interface between your private body and the public world. They touch door handles, phones, railings, food packaging, faces. They are excellent at carrying organisms because they are warm and busy. Soap works not because it is mystical, but because it disrupts membranes and helps lift particles and microbes from skin, letting water carry them away. Soap molecules have one end that likes water and one end that likes oils. They wedge into greasy films, into microbial membranes, and pull things apart. Then friction and rinsing do the rest. This is chemistry doing janitorial work. Alcohol-based sanitizers work too for many microbes by denaturing proteins and disrupting membranes, but they are less effective against certain hardy forms, like spores. So even here, the theme repeats. Know the mechanism, choose the right tool, not fear. Fit. Now, your mind can hover over one final modern scene, one that ties outbreak investigation back to the ordinary comfort of your home. Imagine a small city detects E. coli in part of its water system after heavy rain, not cholera this time, but the same story of contamination risk. The water department sees turbidity rise. They see chlorine residual drop in a pressure zone. They sample again, confirm the result, and issue a boil water advisory. People grumble because boiling water is inconvenient. They fill pots, they wait for bubbles, they let it cool. It is boring. And in that boredom is protection. Meanwhile, crews search for the cause. A broken main, a cross-connection where non-potable water could enter, a backflow prevention device. That failed. They isolate the area, flush lines, increase disinfection, repair the break. They sample repeatedly because one clean test is not enough. They wait for consecutive negatives. Then they lift the advisory. No parade, no statue, just water returning to invisibility. And that is the kind of ending you want again and again in public health. Not a dramatic victory, a quiet return to normal routines. Now, you can feel the story preparing to drift back toward the simplest image of all, a map that brought clarity and the systems